From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Tuesday, February 18. Australians deserve a rate cut after a year of stagnation. That's the plea from federal ministers as the Reserve Bank Board prepares for its first meeting of the year. At 2:30pm on Tuesday, we'll find out if the bank will finally shift the cash rate from 4.35%. Head to theaustralian.com.au to make sure you're the first to know. Students are failing to grasp the basics of Australian democracy and political systems. Only about 30% of Year 10 students meet or exceed the proficient standards. That's the lowest since testing began back in 2004. And Australia's art scene has been rocked by a major controversy. Artist Khaled Sabsabi was picked and then sacked from representing Australia at the Venice Biennale in 2026. The decision has led to accusations of political interference and left the country's official arts council in a shambles. That's today's story. The Venice Biennale is a bit like the Olympics for the arts, a 130-year-old international exhibition where artists are chosen by their countries to show their works and hopefully push some boundaries in the way only art can. Venice is where post-impressionist Henri Matisse and surrealists Edouard Munch and René Magritte hit the international consciousness in the early 20th century. In 1934, Adolf Hitler showed up. In 1966, Japanese outsider Yayoi Kusama staged a guerrilla show that set her on track to be the world's most popular artist today. In the 70s, an Italian artist put a boy with Down syndrome on display. And last year, activists demanded Israel be excluded, and then Israel's chosen artist refused to unlock the pavilion until there was a ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza. The locked Israeli pavilion attracted protesters anyway. The 2024 Biennale was an important moment for Australia too. Archie Moore, a Kamilaroi Bigambul artist, won a Golden Lion, joining the ranks of former winners like Cy Twombly, Alberto Giacometti, Robert Rauschenberg and Henry Moore. It was a huge win for Creative Australia, the government body in charge of choosing a curator and an artist for the exhibit. But less than a year later, Creative Australia is in turmoil, and it all has to do with an artist they picked and then dumped for 2026.
My name is Khaled Sabsabi. I'm a visual artist and a cultural practitioner. My connection with art started at a really young age. In Lebanon, I would sit and draw, being 6 and 7 years old.
Khaled Sabsabi was born in Lebanon but migrated with his family to Australia in the 70s.
Expression is hip-hop is expression and poetry, and that's all.
Eventually, Sabsabi found his way to the art world, working across sound, installations and video. A lot of Sabsabi's work plays with identity, ideology and religion, like his 2006 video, Thank You Very Much. In the short work, several clips of the 9/11 attack are frenetically edited together, finishing on this line from former President George Bush.
Thank you very much.
On February 4, Creative Australia, that's the government's vehicle for investing in the arts, announced Australia's representatives at the 2026 Biennale would be Khaled Sabsabi and curator Michael D'Agostino.
Immediately, that saw a flurry of messages come through on my phone from people who had a view about that.
This is Yoni Bashan, the co-editor of our business column Margin Call.
Now, I'd never heard of this guy before. I'm not an arts reporter. I write business gossip in The Australian. You know, I'm tied up in the corporate world. This is all a bit too fluty for me, this sort of stuff. But people were coming to me and saying, look, this is a really unusual decision that's been made by this agency called Creative Australia, which I think I'd heard of at the time. Another obscure government agency amply funded with, millions and millions of dollars of taxpayer funds. So I took a look at it. And as you'll remember, I consulted with you. I came over to your desk and I said, look, I've had a look at this guy's art. I think it's a little bit ambiguous on the question of whether he is an out-and-out supporter of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the terrorist group Hezbollah.
Sabsabi's work You from 2007, which is still available on his website and that of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, features a video recording of the late Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Glowing beams of light emanate from Nasrallah's mouth and eyes as he talks.
Some of his art seems to chronicle what occurred in Lebanon after the 2006 war with Israel, which lasted 34 days. So, for example, in that case, Sabsabi did a series of watercolours about Lebanon, one for each day of the war, so a series of 34. And there's plenty of imagery in those watercolours of a devastated landscape and buildings that have fallen down and kids picking through rubble. All the images that you would expect. And then suddenly there's a picture of Nasrallah. And, interesting, questionable, should that have been there? It's not for me to decide. I'm a journalist, I'm not an arts patron. Me as the writer, as the journo, it's not for me to figure out or solve the mystery of what Khaled Sabsabi thinks about Hassan Nasrallah. My job is to ask the question, well, here is an artist who receives ample taxpayer funds to produce his work and then is chosen by Creative Australia to represent all Australians at the Venice Biennale. Was this the correct choice for Creative Australia to pursue? And after that question was posed in the Margin Call column, it seemed that everything seemed to come undone for Sabsabi from there. We had questions raised in Parliament.
Why is the Albanese government allowing a person who highlights a terrorist leader in his artwork to represent Australia on the international stage at the Venice Biennale?
Excellent. Thank you, Senator Chandler. Minister Wong.
Thank you, President. Senator, I wasn't aware of the facts as you outlined in your question until now. I agree with you that any glorification of the Hezbollah leader Nasrallah is inappropriate. We condemn Hezbollah unequivocally.
Will the Albanese government immediately reverse the decision for Mr Sabsabi to represent Australia at the Venice Biennale?
Senator Cash, if you could just let me answer.
Simple answer, yes. Order. Order.
Senator, I wasn't aware of this until you asked me. I certainly will get advice and I share your concerns about Hezbollah.
We had an urgent late-night board meeting called by Creative Australia just a few days after they proudly announced him as the representative. And then spectacularly, the board unanimously decided to withdraw his selection. And we've seen just a tremendous amount of fallout from there.
Coming up, how the arts community has reacted. What we were talking about in the newsroom is the idea that an artwork depicting a very controversial figure is not necessarily in and of itself problematic. I could imagine that artwork depicting Vladimir Putin or Osama bin Laden and being ambiguous, prompting questions, which is what art is supposed to do, about whether this person deserves to be deified and why people either loathe or love this person. So it's intriguing then, given that Sabsabi's work could be interpreted as ambiguous, that Creative Australia acted so quickly to drop him from the Biennale, something they've never done before. What's your instinct about why? Is it because, in fact, the work is not really ambiguous and, in fact, they believe that he is deifying a figure like Hassan Nasrallah?
I don't think that's the issue. I don't think that this was a conflict at the board level of Creative Australia about tastes and values. I think they're supportive of art in all its forms and in the forms that you just specified. But I think the issue with Sabsabi and Creative Australia is that it quickly became a political matter and it became a political hot potato. I mean, consider the environment we're in at the moment where the motor force of our cultural dialogue at the moment is largely about anti-Semitism, if it's not cost of living, for example. But we're talking about these issues and Creative Australia optically is seen to have chosen a person who has on numerous occasions placed Hassan Nasrallah in his art and on at least one occasion at the centre of his work. And at the same time, Sabsabi hasn't been shy about vocalising his views on the Middle East and conflicts in the Middle East. So, for example, Sabsabi was someone who boycotted the 2022 Sydney Festival merely because the organisers of the Sydney Festival had accepted a $20,000 funding sponsorship grant from the Israeli embassy. And that wasn't to host the festival itself. It was actually to host a choreographed work by an Israeli choreographer. So on that basis, a large number of artists decided to boycott the festival, and Sabsabi was one of them. But Creative Australia's decision to withdraw its selection of him smacks of a board running scared from a political shitfight, one that just that day had been ventilated in federal parliament.
Yeah, and now the board itself, despite that unanimous decision, is itself the subject of ructions. So probably one of Australia's most famous currently working artists, Lindy Lee, whose huge sculpture was unveiled outside the National Gallery of Australia just a few months ago, has quit the board. What do you think is going on within that board?
It's really interesting with Lindy Lee in particular because from what I understand, it certainly looked as though she had quit in protest over this decision. She didn't suddenly leave the board because of health reasons or any other matter. I mean, she had written a letter to the board, which hasn't been made public, but I've had part of its contents read to me. And what I've been told about her reasons for resigning is not that she did so in protest necessarily. In fact, in her letter to the board, she said that she supported the unanimous decision to withdraw Sabsabi's selection, which is incredible in itself. But given that she supported the board's decision to do so, it would seem that for one reason or another, her position has become untenable. And that was her decision for leaving.
Yoni, the other thing that's happened is that a very prominent philanthropist, Simon Mordaunt, who's funded a lot of Australia's entries to the Venice Biennale, has resigned as a Biennale ambassador and withdrawn his financial pledge to support Australia's participation. There have also been two senior Creative Australia figures depart, Michaela Tai and Tamina Maskinya, who are working there and responsible for handing out grants. What's your sense of where this drama goes now?
Well, I think we're going to see continued protests. A week ago, we had staff walkouts from some Creative Australia facilities. I think more significantly, this is going to Senate estimates. And when this does come up at Senate estimates, it's my expectation that a more fulsome explanation of what actually occurred in this selection process will unfold. And I think there are a couple of surprises that are probably in store. I do wonder very seriously about the future of the agency under its CEO, Adrian Khaled. I think people following this story will be asking questions about the transparency of the grant processes that have existed at Creative Australia for a number of years. I think they'll be wondering about some of the people who've been employed at Creative Australia and their ideological leanings and biases in some cases. So I do think that there is the opportunity for a reckoning to take place and for a magnification of the inner workings of Creative Australia. It strikes me as one of these classic government agencies that no one really pays attention to and that kind of exists in the shadows of the much larger departments. You know, we always talk about Treasury, we talk about the Department of Health. We don't really talk about the obscure little satellite agencies that kind of orbit the rest of the federal government, but are recipients of huge amounts of taxpayer funding. And its people are custodians for this funding and they kind of operate in these shadows. I think the irony of a situation like the one we're talking about now is that yes, we're talking about the withdrawal of Khaled Sabsabi, an artist that some people may have heard of, many people wouldn't have. But what this is going to end up leading to is far more scrutiny of Creative Australia and the people who've been running it.
Yoni Bashan's column Margin Call is in The Australian Tuesday to Saturday and online all the time at theaustralian.com.au.